Yeah.
Are you sure?
I am. No, because
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
I can tell by that clock.
Oh, look at your
which
mask.
is off.
Can I see
Good
that?
morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
It's
Shalom.
so fabulous to be together again. The world is challenged, and the time is challenged, but it's so comforting and connecting and reassuring to see you guys and to be with you. Thank you for learning with us this Shabbat morning. And let's begin by thanking God for the gift of learning Torah together on page 63. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Torah b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'nihya anachnu v'tzatzeinu v'tzatzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah l'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan banu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So let's just jump in. As everybody knows, next Shabbat is Rosh Hashanah, and as everybody knows, this year's Rosh Hashanah next week will be unlike any other that any of us has ever had in our lives. A digital high holidays, a virtual Rosh Hashanah, an online high holidays. We did a Zoom Passover, but Passover is usually done in the home anyway, so you do it on the home with a screen. This is a whole new dimension, a Zoom or a live stream Rosh Hashanah, when we're usually in the shul with all the energy and sitting in your own seats on the pews with your neighbors over the years, and that's not here. So the question is, how are we going to have a fabulous Rosh Hashanah at home? And to that end, I sent out in the email yesterday this document, which was in that email, which you could download, the Rosh Hashanah Seder put out by the Rabbinical Assembly. As I indicated in the email, it was produced for this moment. It was produced for our world, for our time right now, when you can't go to shul on Rosh Hashanah, when you have to connect online. And the way we're going to do today is I'm going to invite each of my colleagues to take about 7 minutes and talk about how we can have a fabulous, ever more meaningful Rosh Hashanah at home, and to figure out how this Seder can help. So, Lisa, I'm going to start with you, and if you could just talk about how the word Seder, which we usually associate with Pesach, how does it end up in a Rosh Hashanah document?
Yeah, so some of this is, I think, a little hypothesis. I first came in touch with the Rosh Hashanah Seder when I went to college in Nashville, and I was very close friends with a Persian family, a Persian friend and his family in Nashville, and they had the most amazing holiday gatherings. And they invited me for Rosh Hashanah, and that sounded great. And I got there, and the table looked very much like Passover, only with all these foods that I'd never recognized before. And it was so cool. Before we ate, every food had a blessing, and every food had a secret meaning. And I thought it was awesome. It was totally awesome, a really meaningful way to bring in the holiday. Why does this come? There's a very interesting question that comes up between the Torah and the rabbinic tradition. If you read the Torah and you read it seriously, you'd think that Nisan is the first of the month, that Passover is actually like the first of the year. And somehow between the Torah and the Mishnah, the rabbis change their mind or reinterpret the text, and suddenly the first of the year is Tishrei, as Rosh Hashanah is in the fall. And so what happens is we have these sort of two New Year centers. And I think the Sephardi tradition creates a bridge between these two New Years. The Passover New Year is a new year and a redemption from external imposing forces. And the Rosh Hashanah becomes a redemption and a renewal from internal imposing forces. And so it creates this way for us to see ourselves, not just the Egyptian taskmasters, not just the forces in our world of injustice, but to turn inwards and to see how we can overcome challenges. And one of the ways we can do this is through the ritual, sort of a magical ritual of using food to create what we want. So you'll notice in the Seder, if you go to page 15, there are all these different foods, and the foods that they list here are traditional foods that would be eaten at a Sephardic Rosh Hashanah Seder, though there are some...
15.
Page 15, yes. There are some that are a little bit different. Many Sephardi families will not use fish heads, and I'll get to that. The way that foods are used, right, in the Passover Seder, every food is a symbol for a deep meaning. In a Rosh Hashanah Seder, the way foods become symbols is that their names are somehow a play on what you hope to create. So let me give you an example in English, and then we'll move to Hebrew. Today, many Jews will put celery on their table, on the Rosh Hashanah table. Why? Because celery sounds sort of like salary. And if you eat a lot of celery, you might have a lot of salary in that year. It's like a play on that word. The reason that some Sephardi Jews don't have fish or fish heads on their tables is because the word for fish in Hebrew is dag, which sounds kind of like the word for worry, dag. And so you don't want to have worries on your table, so instead they'll use a different animal head. That comes from a verse about being a head, not a tail. But all of these things, gezer, the word for carrot. Carrots are really good for your eyes, but it turns out the word for gezer also sounds a little bit like gzar dinam, with the words for the decree, the divine decree. And so there's some sense that if you chomp on a carrot at your Rosh Hashanah Seder, you will chomp out any potential for an evil decree and bring in goodness. So this is all very playful and very fun. I want to just dive two quick things. One, I want to talk specifically about fish heads, and one, I want to talk about how would this apply in your home, and say you're not a fish head person, like what can you do? Specifically about fish heads, this is something I just got to know this summer. As you may remember, I started fishing last summer, and then this summer we caught some fish and started filleting them ourselves. And that's when I discovered that actually the fish head is incredibly delicious. Like some of the best meat, I'm seeing grossed out faces over here. Some of the best meat that exists on a fish is in its collar, which typically gets cut off.
I thought about talking Unetane Tokef.
Who would know that Unetane Tokef is the easier part of the conversation? Right. We could all die tomorrow. Great.
Thank you, Alisa.
That's it. Thank you.
It's also very cost effective, but no, just work with me. So the fish head has the most, some of the most incredible meat on the fish. Chefs use that meat almost exclusively. And what the fish head takes in order to eat it is creativity. It takes a little bit of bravery and a willingness to overcome your ick factor. And it takes foresight. And I think that is a quality that we all need in our years. Like it takes, also it's not as easy as cooking a filet. You have to invest in time and energy in it. And those are some of the qualities that I think we're going for. So I'm guessing none of my colleagues are going to be doing the fish head thing, but what I would just like to leave you with is that part of the playfulness of Rosh Hashanah Seder is thinking together about what you want to create and what could symbolize that. So if you want to do this in your home, totally great to go out and get all of the ingredients listed here and to put that on your table. If you want to talk fish heads, I'm in. But also it's worthwhile to have a conversation with your family. What do you hope to create in this year? What are your goals, and what could we use to symbolize those goals on this table so that other people can witness your goals and help you to bring that into reality?
So Lisa, I sense a tremendous opportunity for all of our members here at Temple Emmanuel to take up our game with the symbolic food department, because most of us, I suspect, or I'll just speak for myself, the only symbolic foods we had on our plate on Rosh Hashanah was apples and honey for a sweet New Year.
And probably around challah.
And maybe around challah, apples and honey. And the round challah had yellow raisins in it for sweet. Okay, so that's our baseline, okay? And now you're suggesting coming up with other kinds of playful foods that embody other kinds of values and an opportunity to have conversation and talk about, etc. So could you just finish off your segment by talking about what you and Solomon and your family do, or either in Denver, Wendy and Alan, or you and Solomon and Amy and Jim? What kinds of foods does your family put on their Rosh Hashanah table to kind of spark that conversation?
So it's so interesting. I have not practiced a Rosh Hashanah Seder since I was in college, so I'm really looking forward to this year. It definitely was not a practice that I grew up with, and since being in college hasn't been a practice I've engaged with. My family somehow adopted we have a New Year's tradition that happens not on either of the Jewish New Years of eating black-eyed peas and greens. So who knows? I'm not in charge of food in our home, so we'll see what happens for Rosh Hashanah.
Okay. Well, so that's point one of the spiritual homework. Come up with a food that's other than apples or honey and round challah with raisins in it, that somehow concretizes a value or an idea or an ideal that you want to work towards this year through food, and that's a very Jewish move. Thank you, Eliza. Elias, you're up.
Thank you. Now to the easy part. Thank you, Elisa. That was perfect.
Someday I'm going to feed you fish head. You're going to get to know it. It's great.
Yes. All right. So I have to admit to all of you that this idea of a Rosh Hashanah Seder is very unfamiliar to me. Most of our Rosh Hashanahs, I speak for all of us, is we are done with the marriage service. We eat something with friends and family, and then we are thinking about the next lengthy day that comes after. So we don't think much about Seder, or I'm not familiar with it. So for those who have this guide, on page 18 of the guide is this fabulous prayer, mysterious prayer called Unetane Tokef. And Unetane Tokef has become one of the central prayers of the liturgy in the High Holidays. Let's think that although this is such a powerful and meaningful prayer, it's only recited 3 times a year. 2 days in Rosh Hashanah, 1 Yom Kippur, and that's it. And it's amazing the power. Let's put into context something, where this prayer comes from. It's believed that it comes from the 10th century. Rabbi Ammon of Mainz in Germany. He is asked by the bishop of the town to convert to Catholicism. And Rabbi Ammon says, let me think, 3 days I'll come back and give you an answer. So after 3 days, he doesn't come back. And the bishop ordains to chop his legs, all right? And as a punishment, Rabbi Ammon suggests, why don't you cut my tongue? Because the problem that I have is that I should have said no to you, that even consider the idea of converting. Anyways, so the story tells that after his legs are chopped, he goes to the synagogue, and before the Kedusha, he says, I have a prayer to recite. I want to recite this prayer. He recites the Unetane Tokef that supposedly he wrote, and then the story that 3 days after, Rabbi Kalonimus dreams about this Rabbi Ammon, and in the dream, Rabbi Ammon tells him and teaches him how to recite Unetane Tokef. Beautiful context of this prayer, beautiful story. Well, not so much. Anyways, so here you have on page 18 excerpts of the Unetane Tokef and things to. So it's divided in 5 readers. So each one of the readers is supposed to say a paragraph, holding a Kiddush cup. It's like, this is fascinating. I don't know who wrote this, and I don't know if you know any of these rabbis, but the sole idea of saying, we normally say, let's celebrate, L'chaim, and here we are saying, who will die of fire? Who will die of water? Who will die of coronavirus? Hey, L'chaim! I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me. But anyways, joking aside, I mean, it's like everyone holds a Kiddush cup. Anyways, so joking aside, let's put that aside for a minute, and let's talk about this prayer. I have the honor, and you, Alisa, as well, as Chazanim, reciting this prayer. Okay, it's an immense honor and a kavod given by the liturgy and the congregation for us. But it's a prayer that speaks to all of us. We are only just the emissaries of this prayer. And what it's really scary is this idea that we don't know what's going to happen the next year to all of us, and who will die of, in this case, we can think more recently, Mi Baesh, with the fires, as you mentioned it last night in the West Coast, or obviously the word that it's in our minds all the time, Magefa, the pandemic. And these are words used in your terms that sometimes it goes whoosh over me, whoosh, like I say them, and I focus on certain words. Magefa was never a word that I said it, I tried to do my best, but I never quite understood what it meant. And the idea of, since March, almost 200,000 people in America died of coronavirus, almost 1 million people around the world. But the problem that I have with this prayer, and this is a question I'm going to pose to all of you and to the people on the other side, is how do we think about this idea that God is the righteous judge? And who decides who will live and who will die based on the deeds and based on the good actions that they have done during life? I cannot understand that line. I can understand the fact that it's outrageous to think that 1 million people died because they were wicked. It doesn't make any sense. So we struggle, I believe, all of us struggle, and every clergy person in the Jewish world struggles with this idea that God is judge, and we die because he decides that. Now,
pause, Elias. You're our Chazan. Do you believe when you're chanting that God is judging us?
I believe when I pray, I believe in God, and I believe of the power of God. I cannot come to terms with this idea that He's judging us based on our actions, and then He'll decide who will live or who will die, when it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Unless He goes by different rules, or she or it goes with different rules, by different rules.
Right. So you don't take Unatana Tokef literally.
I cannot live with that.
Does anyone here take it literally? Anyone here think God actually judges us, and based on your...
Let me say something.
Yeah.
As you know all well, Unatana Tokef is followed by Rosh Hashanah, and at the very end, this famous phrase, Uteshuva Tefillah Tzedakah Ma'avirim et Roach Zeira, which we have on page 19, but repentance, prayer, and tzedakah mitigate the severity of the decree. I believe in that, but I don't believe that, even people who do that will die because God decides that they will die.
Right.
The concept of why bad things happen to good people is very...
And by the way, this prayer is probably the single most hurtful prayer and harmful prayer for real people. If you've had a tragedy in your family during the previous year, particularly a tragedy not in the natural order, not that your 97-year-old parent dies, but that, God forbid, a child dies, or somebody dies in the full bloom of life, not at 97. Then this Unatana Tokef is actually an abusive prayer, right? That because somehow does this mean, and if you take it literally, it's incredibly pernicious, and people run away from synagogue, which I completely get, because you're saying that God judged my son to be dead. Last year, God judged my son who's going to die because God has God's ways, and who can buy into that?
Can I rehabilitate a tiny bit of that?
Yeah, please.
So I can't solve the underlying problem, but there is this very powerful verse in there about God noticing, God passing over each of us. We each walk by God. We are seen as a flock of sheep, right? So it both conveys our sense of smallness in the world and also our sense of import and meaning. In a sense, this is the moment when God says, I see you, I see your life, you matter. And there's...
Michelle, you're saying that if you're a sheep in a flock of sheep, that's mattering?
To
me, that's not mattering.
So it's both.
What do you prefer,
right?
to read the brain of a fish?
It's both at the same time, right? When you listen to stories of people who keep sheep, they actually, not to sound too much like fish heads, but they actually know each of their sheep. They have distinct personalities. They have ideas. This one is a particular sheep. It's not just random sheep. We're pretty far from that idea. It certainly conveys a sense of the collective, but it also shows that someone took the time to say, here you are, particular sheep, and I notice you. Your life has meaning. Your life has purpose. And there is the problematic aspect of the judgment there. Right. But I think in some way you can soften that by understanding that perhaps this is a God who may not only be in the role of judge, but also in the role of beloved shepherd to each of us, who is able to say, yes, it's true that you don't control your own destiny, but you actually matter.
Just to sum up, so we have time for anybody else. To me personally, the Unetane Tokef it's mainly two big parts, Unetane Tokef and Rosh Hashanah. I connect much more with Rosh Hashanah because it says, it's asking who will die of certain type of death, and then it mentions at the end with the Shabbat, the Tefillah, Tzedakah. So at no point in that particular chunk paragraph is mentioning that God judges us and he decides who will do and who will die. That is mentioned in Unetane Tokef, not in Rosh Hashanah. So I get much comfortable with the second part of it.
Right.
And to sum up, obviously, the two questions are very useful here at the end. And these are the ones that perhaps we should encourage everybody at home to discuss. I'm not so sure I would do it with a Kiddush cup holding in my hand. So the two questions we can read out loud on page 19. How do you understand the role of repentance, prayer, and tzedakah can have in our lives? It's a beautiful question. In a world where we experience pain, grief, and extreme challenges, what are the ways that we personally mitigate severity?
Beautiful, Elias. Thank you. And by the way, can I just say that when you chant Unetane Tokef on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that is my Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Oh, thank you.
It's just the spiritual highlight of my year when you chant Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's just like you become that prayer and all of the precariousness of the human condition, how fragile we are, and how we want to live. It's beautiful. Thank you. My dear friend Michelle, you're up.
Right. So some things are true that are hard to translate home, and I picked one of those to just dive right into because there are some things that you can absolutely transfer home. You can lift your Kiddush cup, you can celebrate, you can rejoice. You know, you want to sing the Bishana Haba, right? You know, Lishana Ha.
Can I say something between the fish head and the Kiddush cup, who will die? Yeah. You have to save us today.
Okay, I'm saving you. I'm trying. I'm going to try. So, Lishana Tova Tikatevu. You can do that with the Kiddush cup in your hands. There's plenty about Rosh Hashanah that is so celebratory, right? And Malchuyot traditionally is one of those things that should be transferable. Here we are, and we're celebrating the majesty and the wonder and the blessing of God. And yet it's one of the hardest concepts for us to encounter in shul, let alone to bring home. For so many of us, we don't bring home the idea of God's kingship over the world. That's something we recite on dry pages in a prayer book. And in particular, the Malchuyot consists of many different verses which talk about the idea of God's kingship, but we begin it with the Aleinu Malchuyot, which poses one of the most majestic moments in our prayer service. Of course, that's the moment when all the clergy get down. Literally, we fall on our faces, right? And when I was younger, I went to a synagogue where not just the clergy fall on their faces, but everyone in the congregation falls on their faces. And so when I came to Temple Emmanuel, at first, I tried to convince everybody, okay, fall on your faces. And it was something a few people tried, and it made us feel uncomfortable. It was awkward. It was difficult to say in our heads and in our hearts, I accept you, God, as King, so much so that I am so humble and I bow low before you. But there's this beautiful passage here that they bring in Reader 5. It's about the Yalkut Shimoni. It says, Rabbi Dostai Bar Yanai said, come see how God is not like the sovereign of flesh and blood. If you bring a sovereign of flesh and blood a gift, it's not clear whether they will receive it. And if they do, it's not clear whether you will see the face of the sovereign. And even if they do see the face of the sovereign, it's not clear that they will do your will. But this is not true of God. Because when a person gives a coin to the poor, that person merits to see the face of the Shekhinah of God. As it says in Psalms, I will see your face in righteousness, and I will be satisfied when I wake with your likeness. This little piece shifts the goalpost on what God is. and what Malchuyot is. What is kingship? What does glory mean in the world? Glory is the teller at the grocery store. Glory are the nurses and the doctors in the hospital. God's kingship is expressed here through us, which means that when we get down on our faces, we're not only prostrating ourselves before a heavenly God, we're saying we've been laid down. We've been laid flat. We need physically to embody that sense that we and our world are not where they should be. And as we do that, Aleinu l'shabeach, it's upon us to give praise. We have to own this. We have to raise ourselves back up. There's a beautiful tradition that the Aleinu, Malchuyot, was composed by Joshua after the conquest of Jericho. What do you guys know about Jericho? There's sort of one thing everybody knows about Jericho.
Jericho,
Well,
Jericho, Jericho. That's when the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the musical interlude.
Where is that from?
So the walls came tumbling down. And if that's true of the Aleinu, then is associated with this idea of the walls come tumbling down. That's something every single one of us needs in our lives. We need our walls to come tumbling down. Because for so many of us, we've been so wounded, we've been so pained, and we're carrying both this pain and this longing and this hope that we have in their intention with each other. And when we lay ourselves down, literally on the floor, our walls come down, and then perhaps we can find a way to get back up. So I want to encourage each of you this year, perhaps in shul, maybe this is exactly what we need. Because in shul, when we do Malchuyot, we're looking around here and there. Is he going to go down? Is she going to go down? Are we all going to do this? Really? Right? But at home, I invite you to clear a space when we get into the liturgy of the Malchuyot prayers. And when we bow down with us. Lay yourself low. And then participate in that incredible opportunity to think about the ways that your walls can come tumbling down as you lift yourself up. And then one final point, which is that whenever I go down on the bima, whenever you go down on the bima or you go down on the bima, what do we have?
Danny Mando.
Danny Mando, right? Among others, to reach down and lift us up. And even when we're at home by ourselves, let us remember that we still have people in our lives, and we need them, and we need to reach out to them and allow them to help lift us up.
So Michelle, that's such a noble effort, but I just want to name the problem.
She did much better than the fish head and the top of the legs.
No, I just want to be real for a second. I hate kings. Hate kings. I'm nauseated by kings. And Americans are nauseated by kings. We came into existence as a country away from kings. We've all seen Hamilton. We don't like kings, right? And so now we have a problem, which is, kings are arrogant, kings are imperious, kings are all about me, kings are about a huge power differential. Most kings historically basically channel Louis XIV, the state is me, the sun is me, I'm the king, I'm so great, right? And I don't see you, I don't care about you. So we hate kings. So first of all, we have this major metaphor in Rosh Hashanah, the major metaphor, God is king, and we hate kings. Plus, that's just symbolic of a bigger problem, which is most of the language of the Machzor doesn't work for our people. We don't get it, we don't understand it, and not just because it's in Hebrew, but even when you read the English, it just goes, which is why we have to persuade people, please get your Machzor, because for most of our members, the Machzor with the stupid king language is irrelevant to their prayer experience. So can you just talk about the woodenness and inapplicability and irrelevance of prayer language?
So, okay. Sure, in 1 minute.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a 1 minute.
It wasn't quite.
I have a 1-minute answer, and it actually is present on this page, which is that God, as king, is not a king. God is the King of kings. And if I don't like kings, I want my kings to have kings. And so I actually think that that's a very powerful concept in the sense that, yes, our rulers on earth are corrupt. And they are not role models. They are not the things that we would want to be placing on pedestals. But even they have a ruler. And that ruler can be part of helping to do tikkun, to repair the brokenness of our world in an ultimate way. So when prayer language doesn't work for you, right? And when prayer language doesn't work for us, I think I want to ask the question of, can you think more creatively? Can you think out of the box? Not every prayer, prayers, unlike the Torah, prayers were entirely and transparently written by people who expressed certain values and certain ideas. So you can play around with them. First of all, you can choose which ones you're going to say. It's a very long machzor. For those of you who got the full machzor, you got the whole thing there. There are very many beautiful images, and there are very many challenging issues. And each of them demands of us our creativity and our reinterpretation.
Well, on that, and before I get to Dan, here's your spiritual homework I would recommend based on the kings that Michelle presented. If you like kings, knock yourself out. You got a lot of kings. If you don't like kings, here's my question for you. And this is a good Rosh Hashanah week of preparation to think about, and you could maybe talk about this as well during the service with your family. What metaphor do you like? God is my king. If that doesn't work for you, God is my king, it just leaves you cold. What metaphor for God do you like? Dan, you're up.
Thank you. So first of all, I'm just in awe of everybody this morning. It's just amazing. So the machzor is, as Michelle just said, it's huge and it's broad, and there's a lot of metaphors that don't work for us. And Rabbi Chiel, he used to say that if you just chose one thing, take that apart and meditate on it. And what I just loved immediately about this Seder is the inclusion of the piyut at the beginning, near the beginning, which is, I guess it's on page 4, which is Achot Ketana Tefilateha. It's a beautiful piyut, and I just happen to love piyutim. When I think of the Yamim Noraim, I just think of, piyutim, not like, there's so many of them, but they're just so amazing and so beautiful. So I was looking at this particular piyut, and obviously they chose well by including this particular piyut in this year of pandemic. So if we look at the title, Achot Ketana, and it's when we take it apart, we see all the references, and that's what I kind of like to look at. So this is from actually Shir HaShirim, chapter 8, verse 8, where Israel is described as a Achot Ketana, a little sister, and it's traditionally thought of as, Shir HaShirim is thought of as a metaphor for God's love for Israel and Israel's love for God. There's a reciprocal love. And so the use of the sister metaphor alludes also to biblical usage of both the terms brother and sister in the Bible, which denote a particular kind of loving relationship. And it's a relationship that's both affection and a blood relationship, a familial relationship. So it's a combination of both. What I also love about the piyut is the craft of the composer. The person that put it together, which reflects a true immersion into the spirit and the meaning of Rosh Hashanah. To people that took the time to create these very complex prayers meant that they were just so invested and loved every moment of it. So first, this poem is traditionally recited between Mincha and Ma'ariv on Erev Rosh Hashanah. It's an invocation. And just as we are all doing in advance of Rosh Hashanah, the Achot Ketana prepares her praises and her prayers and supplications to God, and it's done actually with melody, with Shir v'Hilulim, and there are many different melodies for this. I found a Moroccan one that goes like this: Achot Ketana Tefilateha, Orcha ve'ona Tehilateha. kind of like that, and just goes on and on. It's really quite beautiful. So we have the sense of chanting that goes on with it. It's an acrostic. You know, I love when the rabbis build their names into the text. This is it was Reb Avraham Chazan Gerundi from the 13th century Catalonian rabbi, and each of the verses starts with the letters of his name. But he also builds in specific biblical references, which I think are always great. When you read these things, it connects us to the whole year and to the cycle. Like, for instance, in the second line, we find the word El Narafan Allah, right, which reminds us of Moses begging for Miriam, and really, in that sense, really for the people. And then the second line in the second stanza begins with Shefoch Haroncha, which reminds us of Shefoch, you know, that we find in the Passover Haggadah. So another connection to Haggadah, and in a slightly different form. And in the fourth stanza, we have Matai Ta'aleh Bitcha Mibor, reminding us of Joseph's being tossed into the pit, and subsequently leading to redemption. And then we have Amar Solu Solu at the end, which is the beginning of the Haftarah that we say on Yom Kippur morning. So it really connects all of these different themes of connection and redemption and love between Israel and the Jewish people. But I also just love what about Piyutim, and this is something you can do at home too. If your Hebrew is good, when you read it, the text just flows. It's such a beautiful text. Achot ketana tefilateha, orcha ve'ona tehilateha, elna refana lemachaloteha, tichle shana v'kilaleha. It just flows. It's such a beautiful kind of text. Now, as I said before, the piyut is just. The other thing I want to mention is that you look at in the last word of each of the lines of the stanzas ends with the letters Yud Hey. So it's a plea for God, and it's a plea for God to be with us. It's the kind of thing that you may notice the first time you read it through. As I mentioned, of course, that this is the perfect piyut for this year in the pandemic. Each of the stanzas is a request for this year of curses to end, except for the last stanza where it's asking us for a year where the blessings will begin. So it's so beautiful. So if you take any piyut or any part of the machzor and just take it apart, little bits at a time, you might just find great meaning. Even while the cantor's chanting Unatana Tokef, you could say, well, that doesn't work for me. Maybe I'll just read this piyut or some other part of the machzor. Of course, that would not.
Yeah, obviously you chose this because in the third paragraph says, Re tzonecha, tend your sheep. So it's basically for Michelle, mention of the sheep.
There's no fish. I don't think there's any fish in it.
Well, it's actually interesting because Rabbi David Golinkin actually posits that they're not sheep at all in the Unatana Tokef, but it comes from Uvnei Maron, which would be an army, troops, right? Yeah. Somebody who is looking at their troops. So there are different interpretations to that. But Dan, I want to ask you a question because I always look at piyutim like the pop songs of the prayer book. These extraordinary, catchy. They're engaging. At the time, they must have been very popular in order to have been pulled in here. But sometimes they feel really bound to a particular time. Right, and they seem to follow particular metaphors that are tough. They're poetic. You have to spend time with piyutim in order to get something out of them. Yeah. Do you have any advice on how to wring out the meaning if I don't happen to have a historical encyclopedia next to me that I can look up all these verses?
Have your BDB or Jasper,
yeah.
or your reference each of the texts. Well, that's a good question. The question, of course, is asked how we can make them say the Rosh Hashanah more meaning for us in this particular year. You don't have to look at a piyut. This is one example of how you can find it, but you can just take any text in the machzor, and the Lev Shalem has such fabulous commentaries on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and below the line. So that might just be a way to engage. Also, you don't have to necessarily know the Hebrew and feel the references to be able to find a really deep meaning in any one of the tefillot or any one of the meditations or piyutim.
Can I
say
add
something?
one thing?
Can I say something?
Last comment, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, very quickly, very quickly. Every single paragraph ends with "Let the year and its curses conclude."
Except for the last one.
Yes, and this is a piyut written in Spain, 13th century.
13th century.
And you may recall that the Alhambra decree, it was the decree for the expulsion of the Jews.
Right, right.
But it started, at least, for example, in Barcelona, started 100 years before that.
Right.
So even in very harsh times, it says, "Let the curse conclude." It's now. It's today. It's
Right.
Corona.
So even,
Right.
yeah, so
And-
even
and-
like what Michelle, like what you said, they're very time bound, but they're not.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just want to add one last thing, which is don't feel limited to the texts that exist. Feel free to also write your own. This is piyutim are written by people. Prayers are written by people. Don't let all your prayers be what's written. Write your own prayers.
Wes, can we continue with this and let somebody else do the prayers?
Absolutely.
9:30, somebody,
Yes.
we're going to sanctuary, we're going to continue with this.
Yes, so long as we have fish heads for Kiddush. Okay, so I want to start with a thought experiment. And I want to ask the four of you just to marinate on this question. I want to ask all of you on live stream to marinate on this question. Imagine that this year you have a breakout year with Teshuvah. Imagine that you become not a better version of you. Not a better version of you. Imagine, just go with this thought experiment. Imagine that this year you become the very best version of you. That you come up with an aggressive Teshuvah plan. I need to work on issues A, B, C, D, and E. And this year, you actually make significant total traction on issues A, B, C, D, and E, so you become the best version of you, okay? You've actually fulfilled your Teshuvah goals. Now, here's the thought experiment question, okay? If that happens, what is the impact of that, right? So if you become the best you can be, what's the impact on you? Then, does it have an impact on your family? Does it make your spouse or your parent or your brother or your sister or your son or your daughter or your grandparent, does it make them any better? What impact does that have on your communities of meaning, whether it's the temple or any other communities of meaning? Does it have an impact on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts where we live? Does it have an impact on the United States of America, our beloved country? Does it have an impact on Israel? Does it have an impact on the world? If you become the best you, does it have an impact? So let me tell you what I was drawn to, but first a story about why I was drawn to it. Shira and I were members of Temple Manual from 1989 to 1993. Both Nad and Sam were born while we were here, and a beloved Rabbi Chill did the Brit Milah for both of our sons. And I was, Shira and I used to come as members of the shul for those years, from 89 to 93. And on Patriots' Day of April, whatever it was, I think it was April 17th that year, 1993, I had made an appointment to see Rabbi Chill, may he rest in peace, at his office at Temple Emmanuel in the old building. And I went to tell him that we were moving from Newton. We were going to live in the holy city of Teaneck, New Jersey, and I was going to the seminary to become a rabbi. And I asked him for a blessing. And I said, would you bless me with something, and I'm going to take this with me to New York and New Jersey. And this was the blessing that Rabbi Chill gave me. I'll never forget this. I remember it as I remember where I was, and I remember him saying it. He says, here's the blessing. Once upon a time, there was a young, idealistic rabbi. And this rabbi dreamed of changing the world. But this rabbi soon came to understand the world didn't listen. And then he dreamed of changing his country, but the country wouldn't listen. And then he dreamed of changing his local community, but the community wouldn't listen. Then he dreamed of looking inward to his own family, but his wife didn't listen and his kids didn't listen. And at the end, he decided maybe on a good day, he could change himself. And maybe on a good day, he could control himself. That, Rabbi Chill said, is the rabbinate. Go out and have a successful rabbinical career. And he left me with that. And so what I took from that was a very important lesson that at best, you can control yourself, have humble expectations, and that if you lose self-control, you lose control. And how many leaders, religious leaders and others, lose their impact because they lose self-control. So that's what I always took from that. Then, if you look on page 17 of this pamphlet, I learned something that I didn't know. The first paragraph of that story is the story that Rabbi Chill told me. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world, but I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my country. When I found I couldn't change my country, I began to focus on my community. However, I discovered that I couldn't change the community, and so as I grew older, I tried to change my family, right? And the Rabbi Chill end of that is you couldn't even change his family. And that's how Rabbi Chill's story ends. But then this adds a second paragraph. And I ask you to think about, and I ask you to think about, do you think the second paragraph is true? Now, as an old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. But I've come to recognize that if long ago I had started with myself, then I would have made an impact on my family. And my family and I could have made an impact on our community. And that, in turn, could have changed the country, and we could all indeed have changed the world. Now, they list 5 basic questions, which are each the same question, but larger concentric circles. What did I do well? What could I do better? What did my family do well? What did my family do better? Community, country, and world, what did they all do well? What did they all do better? Here's the question I want to come back to, which is, do you think that you becoming the best you has impact on anyone other than you? And what's the impact? What's the reach of it? So let me just pause. We'll just take a minute to get some quick reactions, and then I'll close. Do you think that if you become the best you, that you can change our community, change the Commonwealth, change the United States of America, change the world? What are your thoughts on that?
With my whole heart.
You do?
I do, because there's a concept that we often use. I grew up in Jewish summer camp, and there's a concept that we always would use, which is dugma. The idea that you are a role model, you are an example, and when you live in a way that inspires other people, they want to be like you. They want to do the things, and that's true in camps. It's true in families. Kids do not do what we say. They do what we do. They know who we are. They call us on it. And so the values you live are the values your children will at least be inspired to, even if they become different and make different choices themselves. Mm-hmm. And they certainly will not be inspired to values that you do not live. That is for sure true. We can't guarantee that they will do the things that we do, but we can definitely guarantee that they will not do the things that we think or we say we want them to do, but we don't do.
So get that. You becoming the best you has a profound impact on 15 Hobart.
Yeah. Maybe,
okay.
right?
But it could have. Okay.
Ideally.
But what about the Commonwealth?
So
and what
that's
about the country?
camp. So that's, for me, at least, that is what happens at camp. That's what happens at shul. We did this amazing governance process many years ago, led by Adele Bacow, right? And transformed our synagogue community into a community of leaders who really leveraged the strength of our community, but put it front and center intentionally to say we are going to be a community where everybody cares for, supports, and lifts each other up. And you know what? When all of those individuals put that as their goal, we became a community that does that. And our lay leadership today is a healthy, functional lay leadership in a synagogue, which is actually quite a miracle, mazel tov, for accomplishing that, because each individual said, I want to be the best me in that situation, and therefore we became the best us, and our community at Temple Emmanuel continues to be the best us, and we have these amazing role models for each other.
Okay, but let me push further.
Okay, so how do you take it into the world?
The country's on fire, literally is on fire, and our democracy is on fire, and we're facing civil unrest, and we're going to be facing a civil war in November. Does what we do have any impact on that? So
look, it depends how far out your concentric circles can go. But if my concentric circle hits somebody else's concentric circle, who then hits somebody else's concentric circle, then perhaps there can be a ripple effect over time where a firefighter finds the courage within him or herself to go out and go the extra mile to dedicate themselves to that. And somebody says, you know what, I see the dedication of that firefighter, and I think we actually need to change policy. We need to think bigger. We need to change policy so that those firefighters don't have to be out on the front line, and we can prevent wildfires. We can work to change the science around the way we take care of our world and invest in it, because I'm inspired by that firefighter right there who was willing to lay down his life. I think that can have a ripple effect.
Thank you, Michelle. Elias.
I agree 99% of what you said. We live by example, and our kids learn from that. So that's a small change that we can make in the world by providing the next generation, good tools to be better people. That's one thing. We spoke about a few months ago here in this room about radical changes in society, and not by violence, by demonstrations and by pacifically, peacefully protesting, and that is what makes the radical changes in society. It's hard to change, one person. Imagine to change 10,000, who lead the country. I don't know. It's slow, but it's definitely possible.
Dan?
Yeah, I'm trying to take this.
The question is, if you become the best you, what impact does that have on the world beyond you?
No, I understand the question. I'm taking this all in and trying to think. I agree with Michelle, I agree with Elias, but I'm not 100% sure that that's true, because sometimes the best version of you may not be inspirational for anybody else. It may be very self-serving, and maybe that's how you view your own best you. So that's kind of where I am with that.
Eliza.
I'm with Dan. I think I feel a lot of concern about this. I think it's important for us to self-actualize, but I think that we are way too focused on our own worlds and on our own lives and on our own needs, and the more we try to get that perfect, the less inclined we are to turn towards the world and the needs around us. And so I think that when we turn our focus on what are the external needs, what are the places of brokenness in the world, and it's not just up on me to fix me, I have to fix all of that, and that's my driving force, and it's okay if I'm not perfect, it's okay if I haven't mastered all my demons, I actually can get to work on those other bigger things now. That I think is a bigger priority, and I think this in some ways lets you off the hook. I would do that social justice project, but I'm working on me right now. I just need some me time. I say that with that's sort of the voice of my generation, of our world, which is I just have to take some me time. I can't. And that feels really problematic. I think he lived in a really different world where the ethos was us, and the ethos was we pray in the collective and we work on the collective. And so the counter medicine was to focus on yourself. We have the opposite problem, and I don't think this is the medicine I would choose.
Right. And of course, the truth, as often happens in Jewish life, the truth is in both hands, right? We need to balance those two
I was going to say
goals.
So Michelle, when you're talking about dugma, is when you create a role model, dugma, are you doing it for yourself or for other people? See, that's what I was thinking of also. It's not your natural inclination to do certain things, but you do them because you want to be a role model. How does that
Yes,
help?
and.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me just answer this by leaving you with some spiritual homework. I think that our Torah reading this morning speaks so eloquently to this problem, which is, and it's hang around and read the end of Vayelech. Just read the end of Vayelech. Here's how Vayelech ends. This is just so real. This is just so relatable. This is just so amazing. This is why it's worth dedicating your whole life to learning Torah. Moses is at the end of his life, and he says, I'm about to die. And here's what I know. I know that my life has been a failure. I know my life has been a failure. I know that when I die, you are going to ignore everything I just said. 40 years of deeds, 40 years of being a dugma, 40 years of walking the walk and talking the talk and walking the walk, and 40 years of what I did. Zero impact. You don't see, you don't care, you don't follow. And now, Deuteronomy, I've given speech after speech after speech after speech. I've talked my heart out. Those words are for naught. I know that when I die, all you're going to do is violate everything I told you. You're going to not listen to God's laws, and you're going to get exiled, and you're going to get kicked out, and you're going to be suffering all the bad things that I told you were going to happen. I know that's going to happen. So what does Moses do? His words and his deeds don't. His deeds don't work. his words don't work, his speeches don't work. Here's what Moses does. He comes up with a poem. And our reading today ends with Moses coming up with a poem. And these are the values that you might do them, you might not do them, you're not doing them, but this is who I am, this is what I stand for. So here's what I want to say. I would answer this question, no. That is, you could become the best you in the world, and I just think you can't be too humble. I just think you can't have low enough expectations. You can't have low enough expectations about the impact of your deeds. You can't be too humble. The world doesn't know, the world doesn't care. But what you can control is that you never lose sight of your highest ideals. And even though Moses knows that you're not going to listen to me, you're going to get kicked out, he comes up with Ha'azinu, next week's reading. I just love Moses, love Torah. Moses comes up with Ha'azinu and says, you know what? I know it didn't work, but this is who I am. So I want to tell you who I am. I want to tell you who I aspire to be, and this is my dream for who I aspire us to be. Get this book, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times by Jonathan Sacks. That's going to be our T.E. Reid's book. This is an incredible book. I just want to end with one paragraph. This is a poem from Jonathan Sacks, and I'm adopting it as my poem and as my reason for being. And it comes from the moral tradition of Judaism. This is Jonathan Sacks. Love your neighbor. Love the stranger. Hear the cry of the otherwise unheard. Liberate the poor from their poverty. Care for the dignity of all. Let those who have more than they need share their blessings with those who have less. Feed the hungry. House the homeless. Heal the sick in body and mind. Fight injustice, whoever it is done by, and whoever it is done against. And do these things because, being human, we are bound by a covenant of human solidarity, whatever our color or culture, class, or creed. That is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks on the moral tradition of Judaism, restoring the common good in divided times. First of all, please get this book, Morality. I can't recommend a better book for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur than Morality by Rabbi Sacks. It's just published. And let's all work on our poem together, a poem of restoring decency and humanity to the world. We might not succeed, but we got to keep trying.
Amen.
Elias, you got a song for us?
Cold.
Can we sing something about kings?
Fish heads, fish heads.
No, I got one. How about
You got a song there.
Haolam Kulo.
Gesher tzar meod, Gesher tzar meod, Gesher tzar meod, kol haolam kulo. Gesher tzar meod, Gesher tzar meod. V'ha'ikar, v'ha'ikar, lo לפחד כלל, והעיקר, והעיקר, לא לפחד כלל.
Do not fear. In 5 minutes, we're davening from the sanctuary.
And by the way, tonight is Slichot at 8 o'clock. We'll see you then.
Please join us.
Please
Shabbat
join us
shalom.
for Slichot tonight.